The time for members' statements has concluded. I inform the House of the death on 27 July 2023 of Arthur Gordon Dean, a member of this House for the division of Herbert from 1977 to 1983. As a mark of respect to the memory of Gordon Dean, I invite all present to rise in their places. I thank the House. Questions without notice. Are there any questions? I hear the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. At the opening of Parliament last year, the Prime Minister declared, quote, "The Uluru Statement from the Heart represents an opportunity that must be seized, and voice, truth, treaty is the result." On 19 July, the Prime Minister told 2GB's Ben Fordham that it was not natural to assume treaty would follow the voice, and stated, and I quote, "This is not about treaty," and he said that 4 times. Was the Prime Minister being truthful at the opening of Parliament or on 2GB?
Order. Order. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The member for Deakin and the member for Moreton will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition was heard in silence. So will the Prime Minister. He has the call.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question, and he should know, as a member of the Queensland LNP, that the Queensland LNP and the Queensland Government have advanced legislation in Queensland that the Queensland LNP, of which he is a prominent member of, voted for. Voted for on the matter in which he answers.
Order.
That's just
members
a fact.
on my left.
But what is actually before the Australian people is a very clear proposition, of recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia's constitution as our First Peoples. And what is also before the Australian people is listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in order to achieve better results. And he doesn't have to listen to those on this side of the House, he just has to listen to those behind him. Because the member for Barara had this to say: "It's the status quo that is the biggest danger here.
Order.
The system is broken. This is a wonderful country and we're at the top of the league tables on almost every measure. But we've got this gap that hasn't closed despite goodwill and money. Consulting people about the policies and laws that affect them in a formal way, I think, will help." A very constructive contribution from the person.
The member for New England will cease interjecting. I'll hear from the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr Speaker, this goes to the Prime Minister's credibility. Is he willing to demonstrate to the House where he told the truth and where he didn't, instead of this tricky tap dance?
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
From the beginning to end of that point of order, it was an abuse of the standing orders. The whole thing.
I'll remind all members, when taking points of order, simply a matter of stating the point of order, not giving commentary. The Prime Minister was asked about his comments at the opening of Parliament and also on media. Order. The Prime Minister is being relevant, and I'm asking the House, Member for Barker, to listen to the Prime Minister in silence.
Relevant about the question that is before the Australian people. And I say this to those opposite. If you believe that there is something wrong with the question that Australians will actually vote for between October and December this year, then put that case. That's right. Put that case. Exactly right. But you are incapable of doing so. So the No campaign, campaign continues to raise things that are not a part of the question that is before the Australian people. The question that was in legislation that the Leader of the Opposition sat over here and voted for it to be put to the Australian people. And I say this, over coming weeks and indeed months, the Australian people will have the opportunity to have their say, to embrace the opportunity that is there for recognition and for listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in order to achieve better outcomes. I say, if not now, when? If not now, when? We need to embrace this opportunity to enlarge our nation by voting yes.
Concluded. Before I call the member for Higgins, I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the Distinguished Visitors Gallery today is a familiar face to some, the Honourable Neil Andrew AO, former Speaker and member for Wakefield. A very warm welcome to you and your family. I'll hear from the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. What did the Royal Commission into Robodebt's final report find as to who the real victims of Robodebt were?
Order. Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance and the Minister for Government Services.
I thank the member for Higgins for a question about who the real victims of Robodebt were. I draw the attention of the Parliament to Volume 3 of the Royal Commission, Chapter 10, Effects on Robodebt on Individuals, from pages 325 to 346. The Royal Commissioner forensically outlines who the real victims were. The real victims were those who received confusing initial letters which people didn't understand how to reply to. The real victims were those who had changed their address from the Centrelink record, having got off Centrelink, or were homeless. The real victims were those who had their onus of proof reversed, that after the first demand from the government they were required to prove the case wrong, a case of guilty until proven innocent. The real victims were those who were denied reviews because they couldn't provide the payslips of companies which had gone out of business. The real victims were the Centrelink staff required to carry out illegal orders of an unlawful policy. The real victims were those Australians who lived in rural and remote Australia who at no point were ever contemplated in the design of the Robodebt scheme. The real victims were those who suffered stigma exacerbated by the political narrative of the successive Liberal governments. The real victims were those who suffered financial hardship to sell their possessions to pay an unlawfully raised debt. The real victims were those who suffered the effects of unfair accusations. The real victims were those who suffered trauma, anxiety, distress. The real victims were those who took their own lives. The real victims are the mothers of those who took their own lives. The real victims are all those Australians who lost trust in government because of an unlawful scheme run for 4.5 years. I've gone to who the real victims are. But one person who is not a real victim is the member for Cook. Yesterday, the member for Cook claimed that the adverse findings against him were disproportionate, wrong, unsubstantiated or contradicted. The purpose of that statement was to frame himself as the real victim of the Robodebt Royal Commission. The member for Cook said, and I quote, that in making their finding, the Commission sought to reverse the onus of proof to establish their claim. Satire is truly dead in this country when the member for Cook complains about the reversal of onus of proof on him, but not the 434,000 people who did have their reverse onus. And the member for Cook then said the Royal Commission was a quasi-legal process, a new Morrisonian doctrine about the law. The Royal Commission was not quasi-legal, it's real, it was constituted by the law. 46 days of public hearings, over 100 witnesses under oath. And I can see the member for Cook lip-syncing something. Well, let us be very clear. The victims of Robodebt never had their legal costs paid for, never had the chance to see the evidence put against them. The member for Cook is a bottomless well of self-pity and not a drop of mercy for all of the real victims of Robodebt.
Order. Order. I'll hear from the Deputy, the Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Last year, the government announced $5.8 million for an independent Makarata commission. Does the government still support this commission, and exactly what will it do?
Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
The 2023 referendum is about constitutional recognition through a voice. Australians will be asked a simple question. Do you support a change to the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? And let's be clear about what the voice is. The voice will be a committee of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who will give advice to the Parliament and the government on issues that affect their community.
The Minister will pause. Is the Deputy Leader of the Opposition seeking a point of order? She has the call.
Mr Speaker, on relevance, this was a very tight question. It went to one issue and one issue only. Respectfully to you and to the Minister, I ask that you bring the Minister back to the question.
The Minister has had a order. I'll make that determination. The Minister has a preamble. The question was about the Makarata Commission and funding from the government, from her government, and does the government still support the Commission and what will it do? Just to invite her to return to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Members of the Voice will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their local areas and serve for a 6th period. It is about recognition and it's about listening. In the words of NRL legend Jonathan Thurston from North Queensland, our young people deserve the chance to be their best. I've seen the obstacle they face.
What have you got against JT?
Nobody understands that better than the local community. Giving them a say will mean more about our kids reach their potential. That's what the Voice is about. So I say to Australians, vote yes for unity, hope and to make a positive difference.
The Minister's concluded her answer. I give the call to the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Could the Prime Minister please respond to the revelations in the final report of the Royal Commission into Robodebt?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Hunter for his question. The Robodebt Royal Commission exposed a shocking abuse of trust, an illegal program that was used to crush vulnerable people, an illegal program used to attack the defenceless. This was not business as usual. Commissioner Holmes wrote on page 102, "The Commission rejects as untrue Mr Morrison's evidence that he was told that income averaging as contemplated was an established practice and a foundational way in which DHS worked." That is just a fact that was found by the Royal Commission. Alarm bells were going off, Mr Speaker. Every member of Parliament had people coming to their electorate office saying that they had these debt notices that they didn't actually owe. And when representations were made to ministers, on every occasion that my office made representation, the debt was either completely waived to zero or was waived substantially. And yet, those people who are most vulnerable are those most likely to have not found their way to an electorate office with a Member of Parliament, grappling with fake debts and the trauma that came with that, trying to fight a system designed to keep them down. The Royal Commission's final report also stated this: Robodebt's unfairness, probable illegality and cruelty became apparent. It should have then been abandoned or revised drastically. It says this: instead, the path taken was to double down. So I've heard since the Royal Commission was handed down, members of those opposite, people who were ministers and had the honour of serving as ministers of the Crown, saying as soon as we're alerted, we shut it down. Not true. They doubled down. They didn't shut it down. They doubled down and continued to attack those. And yesterday, The member for Cook suggested there was only one victim of Robodebt, him. So much self-pity, so little self-awareness, Mr Speaker. But the Leader of the Opposition backed him in last night on the 7:30 report. He's called the Royal Commission a witch hunt. Nothing to say about vulnerable people hounded for money they didn't own. The fact that some of them were driven to their deaths. His only sympathy for Liberal MPs who created this scheme and doubled down on it, even when the alarm bells were going off. The same ideology that leads the Liberal Party to oppose public housing for vulnerable people is what led them to this Robodebt disaster.
Give a call to the honourable member for Ryan.
Question to the Environment Minister. The United Nations says the world is boiling. Australia faces an extreme summer of fires and heat waves like that happening right now in the Northern Hemisphere. In the middle of this climate crisis, you keep approving coal mines and gas projects. Will you commit to showing global leadership and stop approving more coal and gas mines? Or are you happy to see Australia burn too?
Order. The member for Riverina. The Minister for the Environment and Water has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. And I have to say to the member, I am absolutely proud to be part of a government that has been recognised overnight by UNESCO as taking action, strong action on climate change in order to save the Great Barrier Reef.
Members on my left.
What UNESCO said, sources close to UNESCO said to Le Monde, between the previous government and this government, it's a bit like night and day. And indeed it is
Member
a
for
bit
Durack
like
will
night
cease
and
interjecting.
day. Because under the previous government, you had 22 separate climate and energy policies. They didn't land a single one. What have we done since coming to government? In little over a year, we have legislated a trajectory to net zero with a 43% emissions reduction target between now and then. We've legislated a safeguard mechanism to make sure that large projects approved in Australia fit within that trajectory to net zero. We are building a renewable energy system that will see 82% of energy in our grid come from renewables. The solar farms, the wind farms, the hydro plants, the green hydrogen.
The Minister will pause. Order. The member for Griffith will be heard in silence on a point of order.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, the question went directly to the approval of coal and gas projects. We'd like the Minister to address that part of the question.
Well, the question did contain that, but it contained a lot of other topics. Order. So the Minister, if you're going to ask a specific question, it can't contain a whole lot of preamble, because that is what the Minister is entitled to answer. She's being relevant.
Thank you. And Mr Speaker, the difference between those opposite and the Albanese Labor government is we are acting on climate change. We are part of a global commitment to meet the objectives in the Paris Agreement, to keep global warming as low as possible. We know that climate change is a threat to our natural environment, and that is why we are taking action. That's why we've got our legislated path to net zero. That's why we've got the safeguards mechanism. That's why we're investing in renewable energy projects. I've doubled the rate of approval of renewable energy projects since becoming Environment Minister. We're seeing investment in green hydrogen. We're acting on ozone. We're acting on methane. We're acting on electric vehicles. We're acting to electrify our homes and businesses and get that extra renewable energy, that clean, green, renewable energy into our homes and businesses. That's the difference between those opposite and this government. We know that climate change is a threat. We're acting on it. And can I say to those opposite, we know that nothing we do will ever be enough, whether it's on housing, whether it's on renewable energy, whether it's on protecting the poorest and most vulnerable Australians. But I'm proud to be part of a government that is acting to deliver, not just talking about it.
Yeah. Order. Give the call to the member for Makarata.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. How is the Albanese Labor government seeking to deliver cost of living relief for those who need it most? And how is the government rejecting the approach of punishing the most vulnerable?
Give the call to the Minister for Social Services.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for McNamara for his question. Our Strengthening the Safety Net package includes a range of important measures designed to support and target those most vulnerable. If the bill passes the Parliament on September 20, it will deliver a responsible increase to JobSeeker, an increase to Commonwealth rent assistance, of course expand the parenting payment single, and of course the eligibility to the higher rate of JobSeeker for those over 55. This package forms a part of the Albanese government's carefully calibrated action to provide cost of living support to Australians doing it tough. And that's why it is terribly disappointing to see the opposition's position yesterday to reject the $40 boost for many working age and student payments. Many people would be scratching their head and wondering why the Coalition don't want to provide targeted and responsible support for some of Australia's most vulnerable people. Now, rather than taking a bipartisan approach to strengthening the country's safety net, those opposite just want to play politics. Now, we know that the Coalition has a history of promoting policies that are cruel to the most vulnerable Australians, and we don't have to go much further than Robodebt. Thanks to the Royal Commission, Australians now know Robodebt was a catastrophic policy failure which reversed the onus of proof and relied solely on flawed automated system to raise social security debts. Of course, this cruel and crude policy was neither fair or indeed legal. But those in the former government were disinterested in the impact it was having on ordinary Australians. Now, this practice caused suffering to 430,000 Australians. The Robodebt Royal Commission heard countless tragic stories of people being hounded by their government to repay debts they didn't even owe. And while most people recognise that this was a shocking, disgraceful policy, those opposite didn't. Of course, we have the member for Cook, the architect of Robodebt, who'd rather than take responsibility, seem to think he's a victim. But we shouldn't be surprised, because the member for Cook's response was in line with the Leader of the Opposition, who, when the Robodebt Royal Commission was announced, the Leader of the Opposition described it as nothing but a witch hunt. This shows that those opposite never took the Robodebt criticism seriously, and whether it's our $40 increase to those doing it tough or Robodebt, those opposite have showed they can only be cruel when it comes to those on social security.
I'll give the call to the member for Deakin.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I asked the Minister to table the document she read from word for word.
Order. Was the Minister reading from confidential documents? Order. Was the Minister reading from confidential documents? Was the Minister reading from confidential documents? Give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Order. The Minister and the member for Deakin will cease their exchange across the chamber.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Last year, the government announced $5.8 million for an independent Makarata commission. Does the government still support this commission, and what exactly will it do?
Order. The member for Bowman is not helping. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I obviously don't have the Hansard from the earlier question, but it sounded suspiciously like this the exact same question being asked again.
Order. Resume your seat. Under the standing orders, the question can be asked again. Order, and I'm going to invite the minister to answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have asked for is constitutional recognition through a voice. It is about recognising, it's about listening and making a practical difference. And if we didn't believe that before, look at the Draft Productivity Commission report just last week. And in the words of Eddie Betts, the Adelaide and Carlton AFL legend,
the
the
minister will pause. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition is on her feet. Well, I'll hear from the... Well, she's still on her feet, so I'll hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
A point of order on relevance, Mr. Speaker. The question was very specific and it went directly to the Makarata Commission and the Minister's responsibilities. I ask that you bring the Minister back to order and back to the question.
The question, order, from the Leader of the House.
Just to the point of order, if I can add the constant jibes that come from the Leader of the Opposition while the Minister's speaking, including the attempted points of order without standing to take the chair, are completely
Members on my left will cease interjecting.
And continuing. It hasn't been stopping the whole time. It hasn't been stopping the whole time, and the Minister is being relevant to the question.
Order. I'm just going to hear the Minister. She's 30 seconds in, but I'm going to ask her to return to the specifics of the question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's vote yes for recognition, for listening and for better results.
Order. The member for Reed has the call.
My question is to the Minister for Housing. How is the Albanese Labor government seeking to deliver more homes and what is blocking further progress?
Give the call to the Minister for Housing, Homelessness and Small Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Reid for her question. I know that she's very interested in getting more homes on the ground in her electorate, and she understands that we have a broad, ambitious housing agenda because we need to be ambitious, Mr. Speaker. When we came to office, what we inherited was very little action on housing and indeed significant housing challenges, especially when it comes to housing for those that need it most, Mr. Speaker. Those opposite have said more than once that housing was just for the states and territories. But, Mr. Speaker, we've been working with the states and territories and, importantly, with organisations on the front line of housing challenges because they understand the scale of what we inherited. That's why they all want to see our Housing Australia Future Fund pass the Parliament, Mr. Speaker. Whether it be National Shelter, who's described our legislation as the most critical housing legislation to be brought forward for the past 10 years, or Community Housing Industry Association, who declared it absolutely urgent, Mr. Speaker. But importantly, it's about people on the ground that need it most, like Lisa and Sean that I met last week. Lisa, I met. Sean was in hospital. Lisa was telling me that Sean has mobility issues and needed to have an operation. He could not have that operation because he had nowhere to go home to. That's what these homes we're trying to build mean to people on the ground, what they mean to people like Lisa and Sean. This is important because the people who are waiting for public and social housing need these homes and they need them today, Mr. Speaker. The blocking of these bills in the Senate last time has delayed action, so I say to those opposite, to the Liberals, to the Greens, to the Nationals, don't block any more houses for people that need them most. We want to build more homes. They want to block more homes. It's important that they understand and they listen to people like Lisa and Sean who need these homes and need them desperately.
Give the call to the member for Durack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. At the Garma Festival last year, the Minister said the Uluru Statement talks about three things: the voice, treaty and agreement making and truth-telling. Will the voice, treaty, truth process involve any financial payment by the Commonwealth?
I'll give the call to the order. The member for Wright. I'm going to give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. The member for New England.
Mr. Speaker, I have repeatedly stood up here and explained the need for the voice, the need for constitutional recognition, and I have spoken extensively about the Uluru Statement. I refer you back to all of those statements.
The call to the member for Hasluck.
My question is to the Treasurer. What does today's decision on interest rates by the Independent Reserve Bank mean for Australian families and the economy?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you to the wonderful member for Hasluck, Mr. Speaker, for that question. The Reserve Bank has just announced its decision to keep the cash rate on hold at 4.1%, and in doing so, they said that the recent data are consistent with inflation returning to the 2 to 3% target range over the forecast horizon and with output and employment continuing to grow. This will be a big relief for Australians with a mortgage. This is a welcome reprieve for Australians who are already doing it tough enough.
Order.
Australians are still under the pump, even as inflation moderates and even after this decision today, Mr. Speaker. We know that inflation in our economy is coming off, but it's still too high. We understand and we acknowledge that. But we do take some encouragement from the most recent quarterly inflation data, which showed that inflation in the most recent quarter is less than half what it was in the March quarter of 2022 under those opposite. So we see some welcome progress, but there is still some distance to travel, Mr. Speaker.
Gippsland.
In this environment, this government's highest priority is rolling out billions of dollars in cost of living relief for people who are doing it tough. And this relief is targeted to the people who need it most and to the areas where the pressure is most acute, like out-of-pocket health costs and rent and electricity bills. And what we are doing here is we are taking some of the edge off the cost of living pressures without adding to inflation and making the job of the Independent Reserve Bank that much harder. Cost of living relief is a central focus of our three-point plan to address inflation. Help people doing it tough, a bigger surplus to take the pressure off inflation and invest in the supply-side challenges in our economy which have been neglected for too long over the wasted decade, Mr. Speaker. We are making progress in this fight against inflation. Now, don't forget, Mr. Speaker, when government changed hands last year, we had quarterly inflation more than double what it is now. We had rates already rising. We had huge deficits as far as the eye can see, and we didn't have enough to show for $1 trillion in Liberal debt that they had racked up. And now, Mr. Speaker,
Order. The member for Groom will cease interjecting.
Now, Mr. Speaker, partly as a consequence of our responsible economic management, we're seeing inflation moderating. We're seeing record job creation. We're seeing the first surplus in 15 years, saving us billions of dollars in interest costs on their debt. We are cleaning up the mess that they left us, Mr. Speaker, and building the foundations for a stronger economy and a better future. So today's decision is a welcome reprieve, Mr. Speaker. There will be a sigh of relief around Australia, but people are still under the pump. People are still under the pump, and we will continue to take seriously our responsibilities in this inflation fight, which is far from over.
Concluded. The call to the member for Parkes.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Water. I refer to the Minister's answer yesterday, which failed to rule out the government requiring farmers to undertake mandatory cultural heritage surveys. Has the government undertaken modelling on the cost for farming businesses of mandatory obligations like cultural surveys?
The call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
I want to thank the member for his question, and what his question today and yesterday's question referred to are some provisions in Western Australian law. Now, can I be very clear? We are the Commonwealth Government, and we're not proposing to adopt Western Australian law.
Order. 20 seconds in. I'm just going to ask the minister to pause, and I'll hear from the Leader of the Nationals.
To speak on relevance, the question went clearly to the question that was asked yesterday that went to the federal proposed legislation, not Western Australia's. So the minister is not even close to being relevant to the question that has been asked today or yesterday.
Order. Members on my right. It's far too much noise for me to even hear the minister. Just going to bring her back to the question, and she has the call.
Well, in that case, it's difficult to understand what the member's referring to, because what he's referring to is in the Western Australian legislation. But let's take a step back here to look at why this heritage reform legislation is necessary. This is something that came out of the destruction of Juukan Gorge, a 46,000-year-old sacred site. At the time, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition has just said that this did come out of the West Australian government, whereas the Leader of the National Party has said this is nothing to do with Western Australian legislation.
Order.
I'm not clear.
Order. The Leader of the Nationals will cease interjecting, the Minister for Home Affairs will cease interjecting, and the member for McEwen will cease interjecting. Just everyone, I want to hear from the Minister for the Environment to hear her answer to the question of the member for Parkes.
Mr Speaker, they sit next to each other and they can't even get their questions straight. It's bizarre. It's no wonder they're in such trouble. But you know what? I don't often say this, but I do agree with the now Deputy Leader of the Opposition when she said, and I quote, "Indigenous heritage protection remains an all too complex interaction of state, territory and Commonwealth law, and it needs to be addressed through a national conversation." She said, "This is about the government working with Indigenous Australians and recognising their right to determine what's important to them." I support the process she put in train. I support the fact she contracted the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance to develop work in this area. I support the fact that she put $11 million on the table in May before the election to do this work. Can I also say that the work that the member for Leichhardt did in chairing the two inquiries that came out of the Juukan Gorge tragedy,
the member for Barker and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
The work that came out of the Juukan Gorge inquiries led so successfully by the member for Leichhardt when he described
the Leader of the
that there
Nationals
are, and I quote,
will be warned
serious
if he continues
deficiencies
interjecting.
in cultural heritage laws. He said it became apparent to the committee that the legislation designed to protect cultural heritage has in many, many cases directly contributed to the damage and destruction. He said it's time for the legislative frameworks in Australia, in all Australian jurisdictions, to be modernised, to bring meaningful protection to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage. Mr Deputy Speaker.
Order. The minister's time has concluded. Give the order. Order. Members on my left and the minister will cease interjecting so I can hear from the member for Makarata.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. What impact has the Robodebt scheme had on the mental health and well-being of Australians? Why is it important for those who created the scheme to take responsibility?
The call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank my friend for his question, an important question because the report of the Royal Commission into Robodebt puts beyond doubt what the Labor Party and so many other organisations were saying since 2016, that this was, to use the words of the Royal Commission, and I quote, an extraordinary saga illustrating a myriad of ways that things can go wrong through venality, incompetence and cowardice. Mr Speaker, more than 400,000 Australians were unfairly targeted and pursued by their own government. Many of them were already vulnerable, including through mental illness. As the College of Psychiatrists said to the Royal Commission, Mr Speaker, and I quote, Robodebt has unjustifiably stigmatised claimants with mental health conditions, compounded their suffering and placed extra strain upon their families and carers. And as the Prime Minister said, we all saw that through people visiting and calling into our electorate offices, I'm sure, across both sides of this House. But the former government gave no leeway, Mr Speaker, over years. For some, tragically, the pressure was simply too much to bear and lives were lost. As the Commission said, and I quote, "The ill effects of the scheme were varied, extensive, devastating and continuing." Now, you'd think that this might lead the member for Cook to take some lessons from this, but he clearly hasn't. Yesterday, he blamed the public servants, calling back to mind that familiar frame from 2021, "That's not my job." He blamed that the Commission process was somehow vindictive from a government that said to those vulnerable Australians, "We'll find you, we'll track you down, and you may end up in prison." Now, perhaps, Mr Speaker, it's a triumph of hope over experience to expect the member for Cook to take any responsibility for his actions. But what does it say that the Leader of the Opposition last night chose to back the member for Cook's delusional view of that saga instead of fronting up to the damage that it caused to so many vulnerable Australians and standing alongside them instead? Well, the message it does send, Mr Speaker, to all those Australians grappling with poverty, with homelessness, with unemployment and with mental illness is that the Leader of the Opposition and his party have learned nothing. And in their view, they did nothing wrong.
The call to the member for Makarata.
For the Minister for the Environment. The carbon capture and storage project linked to Chevron's Gorgon gas mine is universally recognised as a monumental failure. The government's sea dumping bill would allow CCS projects such as this to go ahead. Specifically, it will enable the colossal Barossa gas mine to proceed. This will be one of the most polluting gas fields in the world. Isn't enabling the Barossa gas mine to proceed by passing the sea dumping bill incompatible with our Paris Agreement obligations?
Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Mackellar. I know that her interest in the environment and her activism on the environment is sincere, and I appreciate her efforts in here. Of course, this bill is not directed at any specific project, and in fact, as any project might come before me, I can't make comments about individual projects. But what I can say in general about this bill is that it implements our international obligations. Australia has already agreed to these obligations under the London Protocol, and the London Protocol is about protecting and preserving our marine environment. The London Protocol is widely acknowledged as best practice in international environmental law and includes rigorous environmental impact assessments, which actually have stronger and broader powers than our current environmental laws. These laws also implement the 2013 amendment to the London Protocol, which will enable us to regulate for innovative new approaches and technologies to tackle climate change, things like ocean fertilisation. Following the passage of this legislation, there are many, many years of regulatory drafting and assessment processes still to happen before any project of the type that she's described could even begin to be considered. We know that we need, as a government, absolutely to take climate change seriously, and I went through in one of my earlier answers a number of the things we're doing to act on climate change, because it is core business for this government. We are absolutely committed to meeting our obligations under the Paris Agreement. We know our resources sector and heavy industry need to decarbonise as quickly as possible. That's why we've legislated our path to net zero, the 43% emissions reduction target by 2030. It's why we're committed to 82% renewables by 2030. And it's why I've doubled the rate of approvals of renewable energy projects. Through the safeguard mechanism, we've established the policy framework to deal with emissions, and every one of those large projects has to fit within that trajectory to net zero. The amendments in this bill are really necessary to ensure that we have a comprehensive regulatory framework that protects our oceans, including things like environmental impact assessments, risk assessments and management frameworks to ensure that best practice is adopted. We need to get that regulation right, but it's not anticipated that there'd be any international projects for some time. What we certainly won't do is do what those opposite did, which is give big handouts, $250 million in wasteful public subsidies to carbon capture and storage. And I know that Minister Bowen actually cancelled that spending in October. I'm very proud of the fact we've had recognition overnight from UNESCO on the action that we've taken as a government.
The call to the member for Cornwall.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. How do the actual findings of the Royal Commission into Robodebt compare with what members of former Liberal governments say about Robodebt?
I'll give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
The member for Cornwall's question is very important to Australians because those opposite would like to think that Robodebt's now in the rear vision mirror of Australian politics and they just want to move on. But the nation cannot move on until those who were in government, now in opposition, actually accept accountability and responsibility, because sure, it is inevitable that if they don't learn the lessons of the past, then Australians can expect it again in the future. Now, the then government ministers have had a lot to say about Robodebt. The member for Cook has said that the Royal Commission findings on him are just wrong, and he, with his trademark blame shifting, just says this is a political lynching of himself, and he just would like Labor to move on. But how does the nation move on when the member for Cook says one thing, but the Commission rejected as untrue Mr Morrison's evidence? It says that the Commission says Mr Morrison knew that the policy proposal that he brought forward to the Cabinet represented a complete reversal of the legal position without explanation. The Royal Commission said Mr Morrison allowed Cabinet to be misled. I repeat that because it seems that some on the front bench don't realise, of the opposition, Mr Morrison allowed Cabinet to be misled because he didn't make the obvious inquiry. It goes on to say that the former Prime Minister of Australia failed to meet his ministerial responsibility to ensure that Cabinet was fully informed. But it wasn't just the member for Cook. A generation of coalition cabinet ministers have had their legacies tainted by the unlawful actions of the Robodebt scheme. I remember Mr Tudge saying he was going to find the welfare cheats and hunt them down. But the Commission said about former Minister Tudge that he made the decision to publicly release the personal details of one particular person to the media following an opinion piece she wrote critical of her treatment by Centrelink. The Royal Commission said that Mr Tudge's use of information about social security recipients in the media to distract from and discourage commentary about the scheme's problems represented an abuse of that power. It said it was all the more reprehensible in view of the power imbalance between the minister and the cohort of people upon whom it could be reasonably expected to depend upon the minister. There was, of course, our friend, the former member for Fadden, Mr Robert, who came up with the new doctrine that Cabinet solidarity meant that he could actually make statements of fact as to the accuracy of debts which he knew could not be right. The Royal Commission said about that Cabinet Minister, nothing compels ministers to knowingly make false statements or statements they know are untrue. The real issue here that Australians want to hear is, does the rest of the coalition agree with Mr Morrison about the Royal Commission, or do they accept responsibilities for breaking the law for 4.5 years?
Give the call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. In the next 3 months, it's expected that around 150,000 households with fixed-rate loans are at risk of falling off a $95 billion refinancing cliff. This will see some homeowners with repayments increasing by 50% overnight. Why then did the Treasurer use 3-year-old data to claim that Australians are finding it easier to pay their mortgages?
The call to the Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, we know that the Shadow Treasurer was expecting a rate rise today because he's come in unprepared and had to read out yesterday's question. And you could see him rifling through his folder, looking in vain for something relevant to say, Mr. Speaker. Now, when it comes to fixed-rate mortgages, this is a substantial part of the pressure that a lot of Australians are feeling as a consequence of interest rates which started rising on their watch. The first interest rate rise in this cycle, which has put a lot of pressure on people, happened in May of 2022,
Member for Deakin.
when they were in government. And interest rates have continued to rise in ways that have put extra pressure on people. And we understand that, and we have acknowledged that throughout. And when it comes to people coming off fixed-rate mortgages onto variable-rate mortgages, this is a substantial part of the pressure. And if you think about it in quarterly terms, the biggest amount of fixed-rate mortgages becoming variable was last quarter. We think on the latest numbers about 17% of fixed-rate mortgages last quarter. 19% last quarter and about 17% this quarter. So there is still a substantial amount of people, but it peaked last quarter and it is coming off. But for those people, obviously higher rates put extra pressure on their household budgets, and that's a big part of the story. More broadly, Mr. Speaker, we all know that interest rates have been rising because we've got, like most advanced major economies around the world, we've got an inflation challenge in our economy. And if the Shadow Treasurer really understood and really cared about the inflation challenge in our economy, he'd acknowledge that the highest quarterly inflation in this cycle, actually for some decades, was the March quarter of 2022 when they were in office. And so what matters here...
Order. The Treasurer will pause and I'll hear from the member for Hume.
Mr. Speaker, relevance. The question was very specific, asking why the Treasurer was using 3-year-old data to try to explain that Australians are finding it easier to pay their mortgages.
The Treasurer is being relevant to the topic of the question, and under the standing orders, as long as being relevant to the topic, he's within the standing orders. If he strays from the question, I'll listen carefully to make sure that he is being relevant. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr. Speaker, every time he opens his mouth, he reminds us why he hardly ever gets a question. And we get the scripted intervention, and he looks down the camera, and we get the angry interventions from the Leader of the Opposition. When the real issue here, Mr. Speaker,
the Treasurer, order. The Treasurer will pause. Members on my right, the Treasurer will just cool his jets. Order. Members on my right. The member for Makarata is warned. It's far too much noise. I want to hear from the member for Petrie on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, it's just on reflecting on the Leader of the Opposition again. Reflecting on members. I mean, if we got up here and said he's got big ears and he...
Resume your seat. Yeah, resume your seat. I appreciate the member for Petrie's intervention. As I was trying to listen to the Treasurer, he was talking about the member for Hume, not the Leader of the Opposition. But I'll just ask the Treasurer to remain relevant to the question, and he can return to the question now. He has the call.
I don't know where to begin with that point of order, Mr. Speaker, so I'll leave it be. When the Shadow Treasurer came up with his prescripted point of order, I was explaining to him, because he clearly doesn't understand, that the inflation challenge in our economy has been present for some time. And that's why rolling out billions of dollars in cost of living help is the first priority, the number one priority of this government, because we've got an inflation challenge. It's the reason why we've got a bigger surplus, taking the pressure off inflation. It's why we're investing in the supply-side challenges in our economy. And we are cleaning up the mess that they left behind, Mr. Speaker, after a wasted decade of missed opportunities.
Time has concluded. Give the call to the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Water. How is the Albanese Labor government acting to protect the Great Barrier Reef, and how is the world responding to these actions?
The call to the Minister for Order. Members, the member for Fisher. I've been clear on this before. The minister hasn't even begun. This has got to stop. When ministers are approaching the dispatch box, particularly some ministers, that is not the time to begin interjecting. If that continues, people will be asked to leave the chamber. Minister for the Environment and Water has the floor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the member for Moreton's question. I know that he is a proud Queenslander and a strong environmentalist, and he would be delighted, as we all are, to hear that overnight UNESCO has agreed that they will not recommend an in danger listing for the Great Barrier Reef. That, of course, is a relief for the 64,000 people who rely on the reef for their jobs, for all Queenslanders and for all Australians, because the reef, of course, is a very special place for all Australians.
The Manager Opposition
Business. The fact is, though, that the World Heritage listing of the reef means that this place is not just special for Australians, it is globally significant. And the fact that before the election UNESCO was proposing to list the reef as in danger, and since the election they have changed their mind and recognised the work that our government is doing to protect the reef is also globally significant.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting.
Now, the thing that's changed between
the Minister will pause.
original...
The Minister will pause. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, I assume, wants to stay for the MPI this afternoon, so she will cease interjecting. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What's changed between the original position where UNESCO was going to list the reef as in danger and now, when they're not proposing to list the reef as in danger? What's changed? The government. There is now a government that recognises the importance of climate
Members
change.
on my left, the member for Barker.
What's changed is that there is a government that is committed to action on climate change. In fact, sources close to UNESCO said to Le Monde, between the previous government and this government, it's a bit like night and day. Of course, they're talking about our increased investment in the reef, doubling funding for reef science, investing more in getting Indigenous rangers out there dealing with crown of thorns starfish and marine science, cancelling damaging dam projects which were going to affect water quality, an additional $150 million for gully stabilisation, for making sure that we're not seeing masses of mud flowing out onto the reef because we're improving water quality, working with farmers, banana farmers, pastoralists, sugarcane farmers to reduce nutrient load going onto the reef, dealing with overfishing. In fact, we're phasing out gillnet fishing on the reef, something that's been talked about for decades, never done by those opposite. Mr Speaker, I'm so proud of the fact that the international community is recognising the efforts of the Albanese Labor government to tackle climate change, to do our share.
Concluded. The member for Curtin is the next person for a question, but I will hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, I just wondered if I could move an extension of time so the Minister could go into further detail about the $1.2 billion.
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
It's clearly a frivolous point of order, and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition is on a warning.
We're going to move to the member for order. We're going to move to the member for Curtin. The Leader of the House makes a good point. If the Deputy Leader of the Opposition interjects one more time, just for the benefit of everyone in the House, she'll be asked to leave the chamber understanding 94A, and there won't be an MPI this afternoon. I hope everyone understands that. Order. Give the call to the member for Curtin.
This is a question for the Minister for Immigration. The government promised it would take a more compassionate approach to asylum seekers. But asylum seekers living in limbo for 10 years are being told to wait another year before resolution. Asylum seekers still don't have access to Medicare, work or a safety net, and there's been no increase to our humanitarian intake. Are these delays due to a lack of will or a lack of capacity, and how will the government deliver on its promise?
Give the call to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Curtin for her question. And I recognise her deep interest in these issues and the engagement that she and I have had over them. I acknowledge in particular that I've been to her electorate and engaged with concerned community members and also people seeking asylum in her community, and I just want to take this opportunity to extend my thoughts to her staff at this moment, who I know are going through a challenging time. On the question she has asked directly, let me say this. I'm very proud to be part of a government that is all about keeping its commitments, in every area. And when it comes to this area of policy, that is particularly important. And I think there are two really big questions that go to how the Albanese government approaches these very difficult questions. The first one is to recognise that we have got to do two things. We have to maintain a secure border without ever losing sense of our humanity and decency as a people. Secondly, we have to change the conversation in this country, which has been debased for so long, in particular under those opposite for nearly a decade. The member for Curtin expresses some concerns, frustration about progress, and let me say a few things to that. We've got to be clear, across every aspect of this government, you don't deal with 9 years' worth of dysfunction in a year. We've got to be straight with people, particularly when issues such as this, which is so fundamental to someone's life, are at stake. But I can tell the member for Curtin this. Last year, we delivered in full the humanitarian program for the first time since 1819, the year 1819. We delivered that program in full. That's a statement of our priorities. We've just concluded the consultations, really deep consultations, around this year's humanitarian program. I'll have a bit more to say about that in the coming days. In terms of the legacy caseload, people trapped in limbo for a decade for no good reason, we've got on with the job. I'm very pleased to inform the House and the member that more than 5,000 people have already been transitioned to permanent visas, giving them the chance to make the contribution they should make in certainty. We have invested in visa processing, something that we've read a bit about lately, something that was deeply neglected by members opposite for so long, so that we can make these changes, so that we can build a system that gives effect to our obligations. Because right now, there are more people forcibly displaced than at any time in human history. Right now, there are more refugees around the world than at any time in human history. We recognise this as a government. We recognise this isn't an Australian problem. This is a global problem in which Australia must play a leading role, and the Albanese government is playing that role.
Give the call to the honourable member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Workplace Relations. How is the Albanese Labor government ensuring workers experiencing family and domestic violence aren't forced to choose between their income and their safety?
Give the call to the Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and the Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Corangamite for the question, and it's particularly important to come today and to come from the member for Corangamite, who in her former role as a mayor was the first employer in the world to establish family and domestic violence leave. From today, 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave is available as a right for all workers who are covered by the Fair Work Act. That's an additional, as of today, an additional 2.2 million workers are eligible. That means now, across the economy, up to 11 million workers are now covered for family and domestic violence leave. Workplaces play a key role in providing critical support. Over 68% of people experiencing family and domestic violence are in paid work. Leaving a violent relationship is already hard. Risks of joblessness, financial stress, homelessness and poverty. This law doesn't fix all of the issues, it just removes one of the barriers in leaving a violent relationship, and that's that someone should no longer have to ask, can I afford to be safe? Family and domestic violence erodes access to work, career progression and financial independence. Overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, this impacts on women. Paid family and domestic violence leave will ease these effects, reducing the gender pay gap, supporting gender equality and increasing women's economic security. We used a really simple principle. Getting out shouldn't mean losing pay. Access to family and domestic violence leave applies differently to most leave entitlements. Normally, a leave entitlement wouldn't extend to casuals, but you shouldn't have to choose between your safety and your pay. Normally, a leave entitlement doesn't start from your first day of work, but you shouldn't have to choose between your safety and your pay. Normally, a leave entitlement's at the base rate of pay, not whatever additional loadings would have been attached to the shift, but you shouldn't have to choose between your safety and your pay. I want to acknowledge that this particular legislative change has come as a result of a long campaign over many years. I acknowledge that it ended up being supported by both sides of the chamber. I want to acknowledge the frontline workers, the unions, the academics and the survivors who drove this change. I want to acknowledge all those in the caucus in particular who campaigned for us to take this policy to the last election, for it to be something that would change in the law in the event of an Albanese Labor government, and acknowledge that now, for 11 million workers covered under the Fair Work Act, they don't need to choose between their safety and their pay.
Give the call to the honourable member for Mallee.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Brendan Reinheimer and his wife are raising 3 children in Haven in my electorate. They reached out to me recently in desperation, having learned that their new electricity charges will cost them an additional $970 over the next 12 months. Will this tricky Prime Minister now admit that Labor's pre-election promise to cut household energy bills by $275 will never be met?
Order. I'm just going to ask the member to withdraw that part of the question.
I withdraw.
I thank the member for withdrawing that. I give the call to the Prime Minister. Order. The member for O'Connor is warned.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for her question, which is about Brendan, and I hope that the member for Mallee told Brendan that she voted against $3 billion of assistance. $3 billion of assistance.
The member for Groom.
If we know that the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as supply chain shortages, has had an impact on global inflation that would appear to be news to those opposite that global inflation has occurred. But one of the positive things that has happened, as the Treasurer has said, about the decision of the Reserve Bank today is in a context of a government that's been determined to get on top of the inflation challenge by providing cost of living relief without putting further pressure on inflation. That has been our objective, which is why instead of a cash stimulus, we designed a scheme together with the New South Wales government, the Queensland government specifically, with the measures that they had to take. In New South Wales, the coalition government brought the parliament back for special legislation to deal with this. And those opposite, the Shadow Treasurer criticises the Perrottet government for the action that they took in concert with us. We don't. No wonder they have pre-selection problems in the New South Wales branch over there with the chaos and dysfunction which is there. We'll continue to do what we can to address cost of living pressures, but we will do so in a way that does not put pressure on inflation, because that is the right thing to do. That is the right thing to do, and I just hope that the member for Mallee, the next time she has the opportunity to actually vote for some support and for relief for people, does the right thing and actually votes for it.
Order. I'll hear from the member for Chisholm.
Thank you so much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. What action is the Albanese Labor government taking to deliver a better and fairer higher education system?
Give the call to the Minister for Education.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the fantastic member for Chisholm for her question. The Universities Accord is the biggest and the broadest review of our higher education system in 15 years, and it's led by the incomparable Professor Mary O'Kane AC. 2 weeks ago, I released the Accord interim report, and what it says is in the years ahead, more jobs will require a university qualification. Today, about 36% of the workforce has a university degree. What this report says is that by the middle of this century, that will be more like 55%. That's a rough estimate, but it gives you an idea of the skills challenge we face in the years and the decades ahead. And what the report argues is the only way to get there is to significantly increase the number of students attending university from our outer suburbs and from our regions. Almost 1 in 2 Aussies in their 20s or 30s today has a university degree, but not everywhere. Not where I grew up, not in the western suburbs of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, not in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, not in the outer suburbs of Perth or Hobart, not in regional Australia. In regional Australia, it's only 13%. In Elizabeth, the northern suburbs of Adelaide, it's only 7%. So where you live has a massive impact on the chances you have about whether you get a crack at going to university. And I want more young Australians to get that chance.
Order.
And part of that is bringing university closer to where people live, bringing the buildings to where the brains are. And that's the first recommendation of this report, to establish more university study hubs, places where you can study for any degree closer to where you live. The evidence shows that they work, that where they exist, participation goes up.
Order. Members on my left.
And there are 34 of these at the moment. Mr Speaker, we will double them. 20 more for the regions and 14 for the first time in the outer suburbs of our major cities. That's the first recommendation of this report. Later this week, I'll introduce legislation to implement 2 further recommendations of this report, and in December, Professor O'Kane will provide me with the final report. It'll cover teaching, research, HECS. How do we make sure TAFE and uni work more closely together? But at its core, what it's about is this: making sure that more kids from our outer suburbs and our regions, more kids from poorer backgrounds, get a crack at going to university. As the Prime Minister says, making sure no one is held back and no one is left behind.
Give the call to the member for order. Give the call to the member for Fairfax.
My question goes to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Many Australians will soon receive energy bills for the month of July, following recent price hikes, and they'll be shocked to learn that they're now paying some of the highest prices in the world. Ray, a constituent of mine, has sent me his bill in disbelief. It's risen by over 30%. Will the minister now admit that Labor's pre-election promise to cut household energy bills by $275 will never be met? Never.
Order. The member for Fairfax will return to his seat. The Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, for the call, and thanks to the honourable member for Fairfax for his very rare question.
in this House, and he's right. He's right, Mr Speaker. You won't hear me say it. You won't hear me say it very often, Mr Speaker.
The minister will
settle down.
The minister will pause. The minister will pause. The minister will pause. The minister has order. Members on my right. The minister has been on his feet for 15 seconds. If the member for Fairfax says one more thing, he will leave the chamber. You cannot simply start screaming across the chamber, this close to me. I give the call to the minister.
Make him stay. You won't hear me say this very often, Mr Speaker, but the honourable member for Fairfax does have a point. People are receiving bills, and they will receive a bill shock, because the bills that people are receiving today are the direct result of the default market offer that the member for whom hid from the Australian people before the last election. That is the fact. That is the stone-cold fact, Mr Speaker. The direct result...
The member for Deakin.
I do know what winds them up. I do know what winds them up, Mr Speaker. The direct result of what the member for whom hid from the Australian people is hitting bills this month. That is the fact. It is the case. It is the case, Mr Speaker, as this government
member for Deakin
has always recognised.
will leave the chamber under 94A.
Make him stay. It is the case, Mr Speaker, as this government has always recognised, that there are pressures on energy bills. That's why we've acted and intervened, Mr Speaker, with no support from those opposite, with the active opposition of those opposite, who the Leader of the Opposition boasts in speeches to APIA that he will rip up. He will rip up the intervention because he wants to see bills go higher. That's his declared position, Mr Speaker. That is the direct result of his policy declaration, just as the direct result of the deceit of the member for Hume, who hid from the Australian people the default market offer, who actually changed the law, signed a regulation to change the law of the land so that these increases would be hidden from the Australian people from the last election. This is the direct result of their actions and the fact that Australia is so exposed to these international circumstances because we had 4 gigawatts of dispatchable power leave the grid and only 1 gigawatt come on is a direct result of their policy indolence over a decade.
The minister has concluded his answer. The member for Lawler has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Government Services. Has the minister considered the findings of the Robodebt Royal Commission that previous coalition governments were warned about the failures of Robodebt, and what is his response?
Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
The Robodebt Royal Commission not only looked at the circumstances surrounding the start of the law-breaking scheme, it also addressed the question whether the law-breaking against vulnerable people, why it went on for 4.5 years, and whether there are any red flags or warnings or signs that this scheme was wrong. The Royal Commission actually says that the beginning of 2017 was the point at which Robodebt's unfairness, probable illegality and cruelty became apparent. The beginning of 2017. The Commission says that it should have been abandoned or revised drastically. An enormous amount of hardship and misery, as well as expense to government that it was so anxious to minimise, would have been averted. But after hearing all the evidence, the Royal Commission said instead the path taken was to double down, to go on the attack in the media against those who complained and maintain the falsehood that the scheme had not changed at all. The government was, the DHS and DSS ministers maintained, acting righteously to recoup taxpayers' money from the undeserving. So 2017, warning signs ignored. The Commission says that the scheme trundled on. The cover-up continued. It says that DSS, the Department of Social Service, seems to have taken little interest in the administrative appeal cases until mid-2018, when the Department of Human Services told the Department of Social Services that an AAT decision said that income averaging in the way of Robodebt was unlawful. There was an AAT decision. The AAT had put reliance on an article by Professor Carney, who subsequently wasn't reappointed to the AAT. There was draft advice from Clayton Ute saying this is right, but it was never acted on. They were told it was wrong and it was never acted on. The Ombudsman, according to the Royal Commission, was deliberately misled. I remind the Coalition trying to gainfully ignore this. The Ombudsman was misled by the former government. This then was used by the government to resist scrutiny of the scheme. So there were many warnings about this scheme, many warnings that the former coalition government was engaging in mass law-breaking of its own laws against the vulnerable. The question, though, for the current opposition, and they've been strangely silent, is do they agree with the member for Cook that this is just an unfair political attack? Surprisingly, the Leader of the Opposition has, but I think now we need clarity from the Opposition and the Leader of the Opposition. Do you accept that the ill effects of the scheme were varied, extensive, devastating and continue? And why don't you just say we broke the law for 4.5 years and we are absolutely sorry?
The call to the Prime Minister.
On that note, Mr Speaker, I ask further questions to be placed on the notice paper.